Hello fight fans and welcome to the ring where we're going to put 5 lenses against each other in a grand matchup for the centuries. In the first corner from Jena, Germany, we have in Leica M mount the Carl Zeiss Biogon 28mm f2.8 lens. From Japan we have the most retro looking lens in the ring, the Nikon Z mount Nikkor 28mm f2.8 SE. From Leitz, Germany, again in Leica M mount, we have the Leica, who has finally made an appearance in a round glass review on the David Hancock channel, something no one, myself included, ever thought I'd have the budget for. The Leica Elmarit-M 28mm f2.8. Again, going back to Japan, we have the Canon RF mount 28mm f2.8 STM. And lastly, we have, wait, just a second. Is this right, guys? Is this a mistake? No, seriously, what's this guy doing here? Really? Wow. Okay, so our last contender, straight from China via the AliExpress slow boat, we have a lens that looks like someone dumpster dove in Miyazaki-san's rejects bin, the Leica M mount Brightin Star XSlim Pro. You know it's a good lens when it says Pro on it. Today's matchup is going to compare these 5 lenses across a wide array of objectively unfair, highly contrived, and relatively uncontrolled environments to see how they compare in myriad areas. Place your bets now and let me know in the comments how you expected this to play out and if you got it right. Now, these lenses are significantly different in design and mount, which was a highly attractive aspect of making this video for me. Most of the specs on these are notably different, including the lens size, the element and group count, their closest focal point, the filter diameter, oh yes, and also the design. There is simply no way to draw easy comparisons across these lenses. And that's a task that's made even harder by the fact that 2 of them, the Canon and Nikon, could only be used on their systems. So to that end, I did a dots test chart sample photo of the 3 Leica M mount lenses on the Sony a7 IV, the Canon RP, and the Nikon Z6. Yes, the sensors are different megapixel counts between the Sony and the others, but the testing on the lenses across the camera systems showed that they had the same results in terms of performance. This shouldn't be a surprise, but I knew that if I didn't discuss this up front, someone, cough cough Jimmy, would ask about it. The diagrams here are all over in terms of layout, composition, and design. For me, that really does make this a particularly interesting contest. Now, of note, the Canon and Nikon have much newer looking designs with heavy use of aspherical elements that have noticeable aspherical shapes. Also, on the Canon and Nikon, the rear elements are not circular. At least the rearmost. I rented these lenses, so I didn't want to take them apart and see if the other ones were this way, but at least the rearmost elements were not circular. Now that may just be a factor of lens housing design, or it could have been done for weight reduction, or I don't know, maybe because images aren't circular, or it could be a mix from each of those columns. So I had expected the rear element shape of those lenses to affect the out of focus area characteristics, but honestly, it didn't appear to do that at all. The M mount lenses all appear to be semi-symmetrical designs at their core, and they have slight design variations that lead to different performance characteristics. There are many ways to skin the cat in optical design, and more than any other video I'm likely to make in this series for a long time, I think that this contest highlights that particularly well. So sharpness rankings I'll base on evaluating the center and corner performance of each lens, based off of the dots test chart as well as the real-world sample photos that I took just to see how well the lenses rendered the texture in my hiking boots. Center sharpness on all the lenses was very good, with the differences in performance being minuscule to the point of pedantic. Arguing over the differences in center sharpness on these lenses is like arguing over the differences in brands of butter. Yeah, sure, some minute differences exist between budget and premium brands, but when the stuff melts on your toast, who cares? Corner performance is where this test gets more interesting, and to that end, this category ended up being ranked almost entirely on how well the lenses performed across the image area. In last, the Brightin Star exhibits field curvature that hangs out until around f16, and it only remedies as a result of the depth of field surpassing the field curvature's severity. This field curvature creates a distracting ring of sharpness in the image areas that should be soft. The Canon has pleasing corners with a mild swirl that clears up about f8. The Leica has staggeringly even blurry areas across the frame, with each aperture delivering uniform for that aperture performance. At the wider apertures, the Nikon has slightly jittery blurry areas. The Zeiss II has some slight jitteriness in the corner areas. To that end, the Leica takes the top spot in this category, followed by the Canon and then the Nikon and Zeiss tying for third. Build quality is amazing on the Zeiss and Leica lenses, which is news that I doubt will shock anyone. The Nikon was very close behind them with that, and the Canon is being downgraded due to slop in the fly-by-wire manual focusing system, and on the Canon, the issue being far worse than on the Nikon and other Canon RF lenses that I've used. The Brightin Star's lens mount fits snugly into my M to E mount adapter, but it's loose in both the RF and Z adapters to the point that the Brightin Star fell out of one of those adapters while I was focusing it, and fortunately I had my hand on the focusing knob, so it just fell into my hand. But the Leica and Zeiss lenses did not have that issue on either the RF or Z-M adapters. So I feel kind of safe in ruling out the adapters for those systems as the culprit for why the Brightin Star fell out of the adapter. Now that's a really significant milling issue, and with the fact that the Brightin Star has a large exposed lens element at the rear that would almost certainly be damaged if it were dropped, well, that lens is getting a huge markdown in this category because lenses should not fall out of their mounts. Contrast in real-world use appears to be functionally identical across the lenses. In testing, the Canon and Nikon lenses appear to have stronger contrast, but that stems from variations in the way that the camera's light meters worked versus the A7 IV that I used for most of the sample images in this video. While all three cameras had the same settings in terms of ISO, aperture, shutter speed, things like that, the raw files they returned had exposure variations, so it seems like the variations in contrast don't stem from anything intrinsic to the lens. It stems from something in the way that the sensor and the software backing it works on the three different cameras. So for this category, I'm going to rank all of these lenses in first place as I have no ability to decisively discern contrast variations across the lenses because the sensor design and the software that affect it are just really playing out very strongly here. Star quality was surprising. I expected the Nikon to trounce the competition here because, well, Nikon usually does. But wow, did this lens deliver terrible stars across the apertures. Like right behind it, the Canon stars were less stars and more like unfocused blurs, sort of like the stars you see after downing a dozen beers and picking a fight with a biker in a random Tuscaloosa dive bar called something like, I don't know, Fat Jack's Mortuary or the Mugshot or something, and that dude breaks a pool cue over your forehead. That's what the stars look like. The Zeiss and Leica lenses both have 10-bladed apertures that deliver nice and reliable results in star quality across the range. The Brightin Star manages to take this one only very slightly because the 10-pointed stars it delivers had very slightly better definition and looked very slightly better across the aperture range than did the Leica and Zeiss stars. Distortion surprised me because the lenses performed very differently. The Canon delivered a distortion performance that made it look like this was meant to be an APS-C lens, and someone in Canon marketing said, "Yeah, but do any photons reach the full-frame image corners? Nice, it's a full-frame lens now." The Brightin Star only slightly outperformed the Canon, though the distortion delivered shows some significant chroma smearing in the corners and field curvature that will manifest later in the test photos. The Nikon edged out the Zeiss and Leica here with exceptionally straight edges. All that said, in real-world use, the only two lenses likely to cause an issue for distortion are the Canon and Brightin Star, the latter of which I can attest to since I own that lens. And yeah, it's never met a straight line. It didn't try to bend like a chicken wishbone. Light loss was another category that surprised me. The Canon has a huge rear glass element, and I expected it to have relatively low light loss if the prevailing YouTube truth, air quotes around truth there, is accurate. That rear element diameter affects light loss. But the Canon had a lot, and there was a sharp drop-off near the corners that is likely to be distracting in real-world use. The Leica took this category with a remarkable performance for wide-angle lens light loss, both in terms of relative light loss as well as the quality of the gradient from center to corner across the apertures. The surprise showing here came from the Brightin Star, which, honestly, I thought would show up for this test already drunk, chug the spittoon, and pass out. Flare and ghosting all combine here because the performance was generally even. The lenses all had no flare of note. Ghosting was present, and though the Canon and Brightin Star take the rear slots due to the prevalence of ghosting in their images, I find that the ghosts they create could be pleasing and potentially quite useful for the right setting. The Zeiss and Leica had good ghost control that only ever seemed to point away from the image center, though the ghosts that both lenses created were as hideous as the world's ugliest bog ghoul. So we're going to go here into the Zidal analysis, and in the center all of the lenses performed fairly well, with a clear standout in the Zeiss, which is so sharp that it renders the pixels of my 36-inch computer monitor in quite visible detail. The Canon is a close second, with this lens having striking sharpness in the middle. Nikon, Leica, and Brightin Star round out the center point performance, with none of the lenses delivering a performance that would be considered poor. The corners tell a much different story, however, with the Canon delivering sharply rendered corner points and the Nikon a hair behind it, with the corner points exhibiting very slight chroma mixed with astigmatism. The Leica outperforms the Zeiss in the corners with an asterisk that, to match the framing, the Leica had to be racked out on a macro adapter to a focus point closer than the designed focus. The Leica does render in relatively the same sharpness and detail out to the corners, though, and slightly edges out the Zeiss in the corner performance. A distant last, the Brightin Star exhibits strong sagittal astigmatism, even with the macro adapter racking the lens out beyond its closest designed focus. In addition, as the test shots will show, this lens also has severe field curvature. This sample photo right now that I'm showing you was taken at f2.8 and the in-lens close focus point with the Brightin Star. What it shows is the boot's texture is in detail and it's sharp and in focus, and then there's this ring of sharp focus around the image periphery and well back from the boot in terms of distance from the lens. This field curvature donut is so strong that it will dunk you in a cup of coffee. Handling was the easiest category to rank, but each lens had different factors in its favor. The Zeiss felt the most well-made of any of the lenses. The aperture ring had third stop detents, and the ring was solid and popped in and out of the stops easily, but it never slid out on its own. The Leica had a great focus throw and smooth handling with an aperture ring that felt a bit less well-refined than the Zeiss, though the Leica lens does include a focus finger grip on the focusing ring, and that's a lovely addition. The Nikon handled as well as the SE design looks good, which is a compliment, and the focusing ring on it absolutely sets the bar for any future Nikon Z lens that I rent or buy. All Nikon Z lenses should have this cosmetic design, by the way.
The Canon edged out the Brightin Star despite the Canon's inaccurate fly-by-wire focusing and tendency to get stuck at the closest focus point and refuse to physically retract. If it weren't for the fact that this is the third Canon RF lens I've used that's had this issue, I'd have written it off as a non-issue likely due to lens use or abuse. But at this point, this just seems to be a thing Canon RF lenses do, this whole getting stuck at the closest focus point. And the Brightin Star, it takes an easy last place here because the aperture ring is hard to use, can easily slide out of place, moves far too easily, and is in general, it's just kinda unpleasant. Yeah, the lens looks cool, it does, but the design sacrificed some significant usability. The comparison shots here will look at 7 photos, 3 with the lenses focused at the Leica and Brightin Star closest focus point, then at f2, 8, 5, 6, and 16 to see how the images compare in terms of real-world framing and sharpness, and depth of field, and then the same series but with the lenses at infinity focus. And now lastly, there will also be an f16 hyperfocal distance comparison photo to look at overall sharpness and marked hyperfocal distance accuracy. With the Canon and Nikon, those lenses have no marked aperture scales, so I focused them manually at f16 to where the infinity focus point was just in focus for the hyperfocal test. The most interesting aspect of this test shot series is that the lenses had different framing. The tripod was placed consistently for each series of photos, but the Canon and Nikon had noticeably different angles of view. They were perceptibly wider than did the M mount contingent of lenses. Now this has a few potential sources. Firstly, the Nikon and Canon lenses were taken on different cameras, and the tripod socket placement relative to the sensor plane in those cameras could be much different, and that would move the framing of those sample photos. Also, the distortion on the Canon could easily pull in added details from the image periphery because it bends the world so much. The Nikon appears to have a slightly wider than 75-degree true angle of view also, which is why it captures a slightly wider image field. Now, this series also shows fairly consistent performance in terms of real-world contrast. The Zeiss does render slightly warmer than the rest of the lenses, with the Nikon rendering slightly cooler, but some of that could be sensor and algorithm-based variations as well. Now, breathing had a clear winner because the Nikon exhibited 0 breathing over a short focus throw of 0.7 meters at a distance of slightly more than 0.5 meters from the camera to the nearest styrene head. The Leica had commendably good performance here too. Apertures for the lenses are mostly stepped with on-camera control for 2 of the lenses. The Brightin Star has a stepless aperture, which on paper is nice, but because of the aperture ring placement, well, good luck using that without getting your fingers in the shot. Front elements were all non-rotating, but on 4 lenses they moved in and out. The Nikon lens has internal focusing, and it is really well suited for focusing shifts with video. Focus throw is estimated because, well, I forgot to measure the degrees before returning the Leica and Zeiss lenses, but I had enough photos of the lenses to make a relatively accurate estimate. Focus rings on the lenses are stationary, but the Brightin Star and Leica have small finger holds that make it easy to perform quick focus shifts by hand. Autofocus noise isn't an evaluated factor, as only 2 of the lenses had autofocus, but on both of those, the AF motors were silent.
Final rankings use golf scoring. The best possible score would be 10, and the worst possible score would be 50. So I went into this test figuring that it would be a shootout between the Zeiss and the Nikon. Honestly, that was where I figured that they would be like probably tied for first place. And to that end, they did rank right next to each other in the final results.
The Leica, though, surprised me, as I expected it to be third by a margin, with the Canon a handful of points behind it. The Brightin Star I expected would be last, but it performed meaningfully better than I thought, and only lost because the technical performance is not up to snuff with honestly significantly more technically refined competition. The key takeaway here for M-mount users is that the Brightin Star in real-world use delivers images that could definitely be worth the price compromise because, as of this video's recording, it sells for US dollars $338 new versus the Leica's $2,795 and the Zeiss's $1,160. I pulled those prices from B&H while I was writing this script. If you want to save yourself a ton of money and can deal with some severe field curvature and very, very fiddly handling, the Brightin Star may be the ideal lens option. The Canon was the biggest surprise for me because when used in the real-world test shots, it performed to a level far below what I would be happy with had I bought it. I was, before this video, giving serious thought to buying this lens to make a review of it, but that looks like it won't be happening now.
My next takeaway is that the Nikon is decidedly the best lens in this lineup. Internal focusing, an amazing minimum focusing distance, technical performance, which was inarguably strong. Now, all of that demonstrates that this is probably the most well-engineered lens in the current class of 28mm f2.8 lenses that are being made today. The only area where the Nikon lens was not strong was in the aperture stars, and quite frankly, to the Nikon engineers who developed the aperture leaves for this, tisk. Really, I think of Nikon lenses, especially the vintage ones, as having absolutely wonderful source point stars in images, and this one does not live up to that. And it's the thing that cost Nikon the top slot in this contest. That said, if I could own a magical camera which could mount all of these lenses, the Nikon is the one I would buy. So yes, the Leica took the top spot points-wise, but really the clear winner here is the Nikon Z mount 28mm. And this lens, the Z mount SE, is so good that when I do buy a Nikon Z body, I will be ordering the 28mm f2.8 SE right alongside of it.